Hello everyone, my name's Eliana, and I'm going to be working on the music score for the game Farm Folks. And as many of you know, this game looks like it's going to shape up to be something really special, and I hope that I can also help work towards that goal on the production end when it comes to music, and possibly sounds. I don't quite know if I'm going to be doing that yet, but stay tuned for that aspect. So, more than just an introduction video, I kind of thought it would be really interesting to follow me sort of like documentary style and what it's like to compose music for a video game. And also I think it's really beneficial for other people who are music producers or like interested in composing to sort of follow me and maybe learn with me as I start working on music for this game. For those of you that don't really know, Farm Folks is basically a farming simulator game, kind of in the same style as Harvest Moon, and also for a more recent kind of exposure to the style, you can look into Stardew Valley. So we'll go ahead and play some of the soundtrack, and then we'll break it down and explain a little bit of what I did. The song that you just heard is going to be one of those that is played during the various seasons within the game. In this case, it's going to be for summer. I plan on having a couple different variations of the summer theme, so entirely different songs depending on what year you're in as far as the game is concerned. So this is going to be one of the first songs that I've created for the season of summer. So when it comes to composing music for a video game, there's some things we have to take into consideration. To really sum things up, there's a couple different directions we can go. We can go for a soundtrack which is sort of environmental and sort of fills space, or we can go for a soundtrack that really takes a presence within the game and is going to be something more in the listener's ear than something that's atmospheric. So anyone who knows me personally should come as no surprise, I'm going to be going with the second option. So when writing game music, for me, some of my favorite game music or music in general is something that has a strong melody and a strong harmony to really drive the music forward. So one of the next things we also need to think about is sort of like what the universe is like in the game that we're writing the music for. So Farm Folks is kind of a game where they're living off of an island called Social Island, and there's really no set date or time. It's kind of a mixture of a lot of different elements. And because of that, this can pose an additional challenge because we have to think about like what sort of instruments might have made their way to this island, what sort of influences might be kind of working towards the music that is going to be played in that particular sort of region. Now, we don't have to stay strictly to this. In some music of the game, we can kind of explore and go outwardly. But for example, if we're writing music for certain environments or characters, then we really need to start to think about like what sort of elements would exist in those spaces that we're working towards, if that makes sense. As you can see here, we have the song mostly being driven by the guitar, and the bass laying down sort of a very strong rhythmic feel alongside with the congas. So first thing you can see, like when it comes down to what we're doing with the guitar, it's pretty simple and straightforward. Let me put on my headphones actually. And what we're really doing is just starting to line out the song with some very simple, straightforward chords. We're not really going into the use of like seventh chords or anything like that, all too much other than here. It's just a very simple progression. And then underlying that, the bass part again is very simple too. But as you can see, like underlying it is this very clear feeling of rhythm and movement. And it's going to be something very crucial to how this game is going to sound and work, because you're always working towards something and there's always movement and things happening. So when I'm composing the score, I'm really trying to think about like maintaining that feeling of forward momentum. So additionally, we have also the percussion kind of driving this too. You can see we have this very unique rhythm with the congas. And throughout this, another thing to take note is we're kind of paying attention to those more 16th note subdivisions. And some of you who have seen my tutorial on creating a bass line that's more funk influenced, again, we're using the same concept again. Now we're doing it in an orchestral manner, but also drawing influences from a lot of what I'm into, which is like jazz, funk, soul. And then also with Brazilian music and percussion, they do the same exact concept of using the 16th note subdivisions to create interest. And we're sort of doing the same thing here, and it's creating its own little sort of syncopation and just laying down a general pattern and beat. I don't want to get too much into it more than that, but that's sort of the main concept we're thinking about when we're creating this. So when everything sort of comes together, we get this. And again, the very beginning of the song, we want to keep it simple and we want to work our way in and have the song evolve and move over time and create sort of a story that then eventually will loop back onto each other. And we're just using some basic stuff with the banjo sort of accenting in the beginning. And then as we get further in the song, that's when we start to introduce our first motif and our first musical sort of element that's melodic. And we'll go ahead and play a little bit of this. And we're sort of also taking into consideration, we're layering multiple instruments together to create this sound. And this is a technique that, you know, orchestra uses all the time. But for me, since I have an electronic music background, it's kind of the same idea of layering different samples together. So one thing we have to really think about too when we're creating music for a game like Farm Folks is that we don't want it to sound too dissonant. People who know my music, a lot of, especially stuff that I've been making recently, is like really augmented and diminished, and it just sounds very wild and out there. But in this case, we really don't want that. You know, it needs to sound peaceful and serene, but that doesn't mean we still can't have moments of tension and release, and we can't have chords that may be augmented or diminished, but when we do, we need to make sure that we're using it in a way that still sounds very harmonious and not too dissonant. And within the song, we're not really doing a whole lot of that. And especially in this progression, it's still going to be a very relaxing, straightforward sort of feeling. However, if you notice kind of with how I'm going about phrasing these various elements, we're not really following the one of the beat. We're sort of following in on syncopated parts of the beat other than at the very beginning. So within this whole melodic structure, we're just really focusing on creating a more syncopated rhythm that's catchy. When it comes to making music, the rhythm is almost going to be more important than the notes itself. And if we're wanting to create something that's very memorable, that's one of the first things we need to take into consideration, which we did. And I don't want to get too much into the detail of sort of like the exact things that I'm playing, but it's just important to note that, of course, much like I mentioned in a previous video I made on writing solos and melodies, we're kind of applying the same concepts of kind of tension and release and sort of resolving the phrase on very safe scale intervals and also just safe notes and melodies. And also we're taking into consideration things like chromaticism that you would hear in a lot of jazz music. And you can see, like, if you're kind of a jazz person, a lot of my phrasing kind of sort of supplements that sort of idea. But we also have to take into consideration that a traditional orchestra, the way they feel rhythm is completely different than sort of a jazz context. So we need to make sure that the structures that they're playing make sense for an orchestra, and the elements that we want to have a lot of swing to them and that sort of feel are going to be musicians that sort of study that style of music. So it's important we really even pay attention on those minute details, because even to a listener who's not really, a musician, they'll kind of pick up on that. And we could talk a little bit about the instruments that we decided to layer. So we went ahead and used oboe, flute, violin, and piano. And within all these, you'll notice that they're all single instruments. We're not creating big layers of multiple instruments. So it's only one violin player, one pianist, one oboe player, one piccolo flute player, which is pretty standard for that, and one flute player. We're not putting a lot of instruments together. And the reason for this is because it's a game about farming and it's a game about like a more intimate setting. We want to create a feeling of closeness with the music. We don't want it to feel quite as far away as something like a big symphony. Well, not we, but I kind of don't want that feel. I just want it to feel more intimate and close. And one of the ways to do that is to use less layers of instruments and kind of keeping it with only a few players in each section. Now, it's not to say you couldn't use a big orchestra and kind of create a similar feel, but to me it made the most sense to have something that sounds a little bit less wide on a soundstage and something more close. Because if you think about a farm, this type of sounds you're going to be conjuring up are things like banjos and acoustic guitars, acoustic basses, electric basses. You may think about fiddles, harmonicas. Again, the whole thing we're doing is sort of pushing that sound. So as the song goes on, the harmonic progression starts to get a little bit more unique and starts to branch out more and get more complex. So this is kind of what this would sound like. So as you can see, we started to use a chromatic descending sort of bass line within this progression, which is a little bit different than what you might expect if you're trying to create a feeling of summer. And it was just something that I wanted to try on a whim and see if it sounded interesting. Sometimes it might be cool to take a device that doesn't normally fit within the context that you're using in a song that you're writing currently. And sometimes if you sort of experiment with it, you can kind of take something that might be used, like for example, this might be used for more of a sad sort of setting, using a progression like this. But by taking it and kind of warping it in our own uses, we can sort of create a totally different feeling with it, where yes, it definitely doesn't sound quite as happy as the beginning of the song, but that's okay, because within the context of everything that becomes before and after, it sort of creates a feeling of movement and emotion within the piece. because of the way things are being played, and because the instrument playing this progression has a more bright texture, meaning there's more high frequencies in the harmonics of the guitar that we're using, because we're using a picked guitar, and we're not using something that's classical or like a guitar that I play, which is a jazz guitar, using those tones that are brighter, but that also have a warmer low end, sort of create a feeling of summer still. It still feels like the melody overall is upbeat, but we have a little bit of tension within there to create sort of a more interesting feeling. I didn't think of it anything more than that, other than I just wanted it to sound different than the first half, and I wanted to create some harmonic interest. So then we start to introduce a new element within it. A lot of people hear it as a harmonica, but it's actually a melodica. I found this cool free instrument called Freelotica that sounds fantastic, and I think it's an excellent choice for what we're doing here. So we introduce this sort of melodic structure on top with a melodica, and within this, because we're creating a more, I guess, melancholic feel within this part of the song, it would make sense that when we're writing the melody for it, that we're using more elongated notes. It's not quite as catchy as the first half, and it almost feels longing. So when we solo the melody, this is sort of what it sounds like. And because the melody itself, you can hear it's very melancholic, especially when it's played on its own, you have to think how a player might actually interpret that music on a sheet. And the way that they might do that is to actually use a lot of crescendos and decrescendos, if that would be the proper term in this instance. Basically that the instrument itself is fading in and out, and that they're using a lot of dynamics within their playing to help sell that feeling of longedness, I guess, if that's even a word. And also you can see within the phrasing, we're using a lot of chromaticism, again, here and here, and all throughout the piece. And what this is also doing is still creating a feeling of tension, but it also gives it somewhat of a jazzy, but I guess in this case it would feel a little bit more like blues. And if you think about what kind of music you might hear on a farm, blues and bluegrass is going to be a big influence on sort of the sound that Soft Shoal Island might have. So, for example, we might end up in other songs making heavy use of something like the blues scale or the pentatonic scale. And within what we're doing here, it might actually kind of already have that feel right off the bat to your ears. And then underneath that, we also have some violins, which is just very straightforward. We're just sort of creating more harmony. There's nothing really particularly interesting going on here, other than that I just wanted to create a soft feeling of harmony in the background within the feeling of the chords that the guitar is playing. And we sort of combine it all together. So you can hear this all combined together when it all culminates. You know, the melody doesn't really sound particularly sad in this context because we have a bass line that feels a little bit more upbeat due to the rhythmic structure of it. And then combined within that and the drums, it lightens up the mood even more when you introduce the acoustic guitar having a bright texture. So everything sort of comes together in a way that doesn't sound particularly sad, but not happy either. So as you can hear, things definitely start to venture out when we get to this part. The harmonic structure gets even more complex than the previous one, and as you can see throughout this piece, it's a constant, very steady flow of increasing harmonic complexity. We're not going from a very simple sort of like triadic chord structure to these extended chords that are non-diatonic and that are sort of moving around without any particular idea of a key center. And it's, you know, not a sudden abrupt thing. It's happening slowly over time. And what this is doing is sort of creating a story. It's adding more tension and release and still sort of selling the idea that this is a fantasy location. So we have all these chords playing, and you can see that we decide to introduce yet another instrument, and that's to add a cello playing sort of its own melody in solo. I actually really love how a cello sounds. It's one of my favorite instruments within the orchestra, and I find that especially in a lot of, I hear it in a lot of video games, and especially in a lot of Japanese-influenced soundtracks. I notice like cello is a very common instrument, and every time I hear the way that these composers sort of write a cello piece, it's just really beautiful, and I wanted to seek to emulate that in my own less experienced way. And another thing too, pretty much any of the sample libraries that I have, the expressiveness is really limited with the cello. You can't really get as expressive of a sound as I want to, and part of that comes down to lack of experience on my part and really needing to learn the libraries, but also I just find you don't get those same articulations in a lot of these libraries that you would with, for example, a violin. So we had to do a little trick here and there to sort of get it to sound good. So let's hear this soloed without any other instruments. Okay, so once again, much like the other solos within all the stuff that I'm writing, you can hear again it sounds pretty jazzy, and that's because we're starting to use a lot more seventh chords, and because of that it allows us to use some more interesting phrasing and note choices that sound more spicy, for lack of a better term. So within this, I'm trying to think about like what sort of things a cello player can reasonably play. I need to spend more time just sort of watching solo cello players, and also maybe going online and just watching instructional videos for people who are maybe cellists themselves. That's something I tend to do a lot for instruments that I don't play especially. So I'll sort of see what's possible by a human to play. So I'm sure there's got to be something in here that's not exactly too super reasonable, but it sounds good, and I don't expect an orchestra to play it anyway, so sounds good to me. Doesn't sound too unreasonable. I think probably a cello player could play this. So within the solo, we're kind of spending time outlining certain aspects of the chord, much like if you want to learn more about that, I did a video on understanding how to write melody, and we use a lot of the same concepts here of like utilizing various chord tones. So as I'm playing this melody in the background, you'll probably notice that I'm using things like outlining the chord tones, much like I did previously throughout the piece, but because we're moving the chords themselves non-diatonically, especially now without too much care for a tonal center within the piece, it creates an interesting, unique feeling of push and pull within the melody. You can see here, especially at the end, because we're going down a semitone, we can use little interesting things like taking the D here and going down to the D flat of the next movement of the chord because of that chromatic movement. And we can use little leading, I don't know what the technical term is, but I just consider them to be like leading tones within to the next part of the melody itself. And to me it sounds really pleasant and really interesting. And yeah. And within this too, we're again thinking about syncopation. We're using spiccato notes up here to move up the scale until we reach that high G note. And by using these sort of like spiccato notes, it just adds a feeling of playfulness to the melody itself, and it makes it so it doesn't feel so serious. One thing you can do, it's a very common device, is taking and using a lot of staccato, spiccato elements within your music. And because we're using that last chord that's moving down a semitone, you can see here every single note leading up to that final note within this melody is a semitone. And because of that, we're building more and more tension because we're using only semitones. So within music, you can think about you have the whole concept of the song, and you can have the feeling of tension throughout the composition globally. Then you move into like each specific part, so kind of like what parts play when, adds certain tension. And then you can think about like certain note choices that you use, and then you can get even more focused in on using things like grace notes, chromatic notes and adding little feelings of micro-tension within the melody. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We're sort of having a huge build-up in tension by using solely chromatic notes. Okay, so as you can hear, things definitely got a lot spicier, and let's talk about that. So we just continued on and sort of made some changes to the chord progression that we had before. So we reintroduced the melodica, and we also layered in a piano playing the same melody structure as the melodica. And speaking of the melody here, if you are someone who's especially into jazz, you'll hear this sort of phrasing, and what I'm playing here is like pretty much straight out of jazz. It may not be as good as probably most of you who play piano, because I'm not very good at it at all. I write most of my stuff in MIDI, but I wanted to think about like sort of jazz phrasing within this context. And remember how I mentioned earlier, when it comes to an orchestra, pretty much most of these people who are playing classical only study classical, which is totally fine. You can spend your whole life studying classical music and barely touch the surface. You know, and same goes for jazz. So if you think about sort of what sort of players you would want to use to emphasize that sound, well, someone who can play piano can probably play melodica, or someone who, you know, can play like any sort of wind instrument can pretty easily pick up maybe how to play melodica. And someone who plays piano, you can have a jazz pianist integrate within an orchestra really nicely. So we decided to use that concept within what we're doing here. So we start off again with the same exact chord structure as the first half of this part of the song, but I thought it would be really fun to spice things up at a part of the song that it wouldn't be entirely expected. So you might maybe expect something like this to happen more at the very end of a phrase, or sort of wrapping up the song, but instead it would be really fun to take this chromatic movement at the beginning part and have this very big peak at a part of the song that might be a little bit less common. And also to help further emphasize that sort of tension, once again we're doing a very simple, straightforward use of chromatic movement. We're taking the 7th chord and just moving it up a semitone until we finally reach our destination chord of E flat major. So we're just kind of going from a C major 7 up chromatically until we have an E flat major 7. And we're playing a little phrase on top of this to help bring everything together. If there's one thing that will help you connect chords that don't make sense, is having a strong melody. If you have a strong melody, you can play so many unique, interesting chord progressions underneath it, because the melody is like the glue that sticks those chords together. And that's exactly what we're really trying to do here. We're just playing this little lick, I guess you could say, that follows up exactly with the chords with each semitone. And then things start to kind of die down a little bit in energy before we move into the next part of the song. And we're trying to also make use of good rhythmic structure. If you're someone who's newer and you're feeling like your music sounds kind of boring, one of the things you really should look back into is good use of rhythm. I started out with making electronic dance music. When I first started making music, the only thing I cared about was having people dance. You know, the feeling of moving the music forward. And in jazz music, good soloing makes use of very different sorts of rhythmic structures. You know, not following just straight eighth notes, using various little bits in between. And that's what we did here in this part too. And once again, within all of this, we're making heavy use of chromaticism. We're making uses of notes that are, whoops. And for me personally, where I got a lot of these influences of this sort of phrasing comes from listening to more gospel music. I noticed that like gospel players like to use a lot of embellishments within their sort of playing, and I find that really interesting. I'm a big fan of Snarky Puppy, so they were a huge influence when it comes to really understanding that type of phrasing. I have a long way to go, but as you can hear, I try to use that within this playing too. And additionally, because I'm using this sort of playing, gospel is very close in relation to blues music, and these chromatic notes creates a little bit of a bluesy feel too. And because we're on a farm, other than bluegrass, another style you'll think to hear is blues. So it all comes together. I feel like I'm a conspiracy theorist, but you know, it kind of makes sense. So I guess the only other thing to really talk about within this part of the song that's most important is that part where we have the chromatic movement up from each major seventh chord to our destination chord. To further emphasize that feeling of tension, we have multiple instruments playing along with it. So we have a guitar playing, a banjo, a flute, and a piccolo flute all at the same time. I might throw in an oboe. I guess I think I forgot to add it, to be honest. But we kind of have all these instruments layering on top to help create more tension and to create more focus on that part of the song. Much like within this shot that I'm composing here with my camera, there's a sense of focus, you have depth of field, what's in focus and what's not. Same way a painter will take a composition and create a feeling of focus using something like the rule of thirds or even breaking it. We're doing the same thing within music. We're sort of thinking about horizontally about what's happening within the song, and then thinking vertically in the sense of all the instruments we can choose from in various registers and kind of hyper-focusing in on that one part to create a feeling of tension. And then once that tension is resolved when we land on our destination chord, we just sort of fill in the space with that emptiness that is left by the notes that are just sort of ringing out. And we take that cello and a viola and sort of layer them together to sort of reference back to that cello solo we had earlier. And we use that sort of information that we gave the listener before. We reference it again at the end to lead into the next phrase of the song, which we won't get into for now at least. I know this first video kind of might be somewhat slow starting out, but I really just wanted to lay out the groundwork for everything that I'm going to be doing in the future videos. So I hope this was enough to at least get you interested and maybe considering on giving me a subscription and following along for the rest of the series. The next video, like I said, is going to be how we would create a song from scratch and sort of how I would think about going about composing one of the songs for the games. And we'll kind of follow various music scores throughout the series, and we'll also probably go into depth about like how we're going to implement it within the game engine and sort of just various ways that we're going to go about that aspect too. But the first and foremost is going to be just focusing on composing the music and sort of where we're coming from, and you know, we'll probably be going over some various music theory concepts and various things about understanding composition, and it's just going to be a lot of stuff that we're going over. But I hope that it's interesting enough to you and that in some way these videos can kind of help you guys when it comes to your productions, and you know, more importantly, you can learn along with me, learning along with the project that I'm doing. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you in the next video.